Welcome to our first lecture of week 9 as we continue to look at America during the tumultuous 1920s. And we've been discussing this for most of the last week or so. We're almost at the conclusion of this decade, but it was quite an eventful decade as we've covered so far, and we've got more to explore today. We're going to focus on discussing national politics during the 1920s, in particular presidential leadership of the first two Republican presidents at the beginning of the decade, and then we will shift and explore African American life during this decade of the 1920s. So let's begin with a look at the presidency and how that impacted American policies from the federal level on down. We've talked a great deal about the progressive era up to this point in the unit. We've discussed the presidencies of Teddy Roosevelt and William Howard Taft and Woodrow Wilson, and how there was a great deal of success from progressive policies championed by the folks that labeled themselves progressives. And when I talk about progressives, I specifically mean sort of this white middle class group that felt that there were massive inequalities in income, in social status, and living conditions that needed to be addressed through federal policies, laws, federal agencies, things of that nature. And they went about trying to get this done by persuading politicians in the first 2 decades of the 20th century, from Roosevelt, who, as we've discussed earlier, took office in 1901 after William McKinley was assassinated, all the way through the Woodrow Wilson presidency, which ended at the conclusion of 1920. In the election of 1920, Warren Harding, a Republican senator from Ohio, was the Republican nominee for the presidency, and he won the 1920 presidential election. Harding ran a version of the front porch campaign, which was popularized by previous Republican presidential candidates in the late 19th century. Coincidentally, candidates who also had strong ties to the state of Ohio, like Harding did. It was first employed by James Garfield in 1880, and then by Benjamin Harrison in 1888, and William McKinley in 1896, all of whom had Ohio ties, all of whom were Republican presidential candidates, and all of whom won the presidency. And the front porch campaign was pretty simple. Instead of traveling all over the country campaigning and trying to speak to as many audiences as you could and as many media outlets as you could, you instead would receive visitors at your home and give a prepared address to a select group of visitors, and then receive those visitors in your home for a reception after the fact. And of course, there were newspaper reporters and columnists from friendly newspapers that would publish your remarks in full, and that's how it reached the masses of the electorate that were unable to attend the actual speeches themselves. So the front porch campaign, sort of a relic of 19th century or late 19th century Republican presidential campaigning. Warren Harding brings it back in 1920, and just like his predecessors in the late 19th century, it proved to be a successful strategy. Interestingly, as a brief aside, the most recent presidential campaign between Donald Trump and Joe Biden in 2020. Several political commentators and analysts compared Joe Biden's campaigning strategy, particularly in the spring and summer months of the campaign, when he largely gave addresses from his home that were televised, as sort of a modern 21st century version of the front porch campaign. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't, but I thought it was interesting that term, the front porch campaigns, came back in an analysis of Joe Biden's campaign strategy during the first 2/3 or so of the 2020 presidential campaign, because we think of front porch campaigning as an antiquated relic of the late 19th century, or in the case of Warren Harding, 1920, which still was 100 years ago. So, after that aside on the front porch campaign and what front porch campaigning entailed, I'll go back to Warren Harding himself. When he was elected, he succeeded 3 consecutive American presidents who, to varying degrees, had overseen progressive policies occurring at the federal level, from the expansion of the federal government to protecting laborers and consumers. We've discussed the Pure Food and Drug Act and factory inspections and trust busting before, antitrust acts, the women's suffrage movements, all of which were progressive policies that in some way, shape, or form came to fruition and became law or became federal policy during the presidencies of either Roosevelt, Taft, and Wilson. By contrast, Warren Harding campaigned on the idea that he would return America to normalcy. That was the first time that word was used in presidential campaigning, normalcy, and it kind of became part of the American lexicon, and you hear it quite often these days. But in the case of Harding, normalcy meant turning the page in the aftermath of World War I, the influenza pandemic that had rocked the nation and the world, much like our current pandemic, from 1918 through 1920, and of course the racial violence that accompanied Red Summer of 1919, which we discussed in detail last week. And Harding's version of normalcy was to oversee a presidential administration that was going to be very much a pro-business administration. And so in order to do this, Harding selected conservative men to key cabinet positions. Charles Evans Hughes was Harding's Secretary of State. Herbert Hoover, who had been a food administrator during World War I, sort of overseeing America's distribution of food and supplies in the war. He is now the Commerce Secretary during the Harding administration, I should say. And Andrew Mellon, another conservative businessman, was appointed to the position of Treasury Secretary during Warren Harding's administration. In addition to these cabinet posts, Harding appointed 4 justices to the U.S. Supreme Court, all of whom were conservative-leaning justices, and this was a blatant attempt to strike down or diminish the reforms that had been enacted during the progressive era. In addition, I should say, to the men that I just listed, Hoover, Mellon, Hughes, who were all conservative men, but very respectable and distinguished cabinet secretaries. They did a solid job in their roles as cabinet secretary. You might disagree with their policies, but everything they did was sort of legal and above board. But several of Harding's other cabinet secretaries, men that he tapped to serve in his administration in key cabinet posts, did not adhere to the same professional ethics that Hoover, Hughes, and Mellon had. Several of these cabinet secretaries engaged in unethical conduct that resulted in a major scandal known as the Teapot Dome. This was a scandal that basically involved the cabinet secretaries, including Albert Fall, the Interior Secretary, and Edwin Denby, the Navy Secretary, basically agreeing to lease federal land in the state of Wyoming to oil companies in exchange for cash. Fall and Denby were convicted for their role in this illegal business transaction and sent to prison. Harding was rocked by the scandal. He did not like the bad publicity and criticism that came his way. In some ways, he was a little bit like Ulysses S. Grant in that some of his cabinet selections indicated poor judgment on his part. He just trusted some men that probably he should have been a little bit more cognizant that these guys were not exactly ethical in their conduct and behavior. So while Harding is reeling from all of the bad press that came with the Teapot Dome scandal, he winds up suffering a heart attack on a trip out to the West Coast. He'd gone out in the summer of 1923 to visit Alaska, which at this time was still a U.S. territory but had not become a state. And on the way back, he suffered a heart attack and died in a hotel room in San Francisco. His body was transported across country via railroad, before the funeral. And as a result of Harding's sudden death, his vice president, Calvin Coolidge, became the president in August of 1923. Coolidge was very similar to Harding in his overall philosophy in terms of really pushing for a business-friendly federal government. Coolidge famously said, "The chief business of the American people is business." And so Coolidge really sought to revert America back to the laissez-faire style of government that characterized the Gilded Age in the late 1800s, particularly in the 1880s. He supported a congressional legislation that drastically reduced taxes on the wealthiest Americans. At one point, at the height of World War I, the wealthiest Americans were being taxed at the rate of 66% of their income and assets. But this congressional legislation reduced that tax rate to 20% by the mid-1920s. Coolidge was very much in favor of this. He really also believed in just letting Congress handle most of the significant policy agendas, and the presidency was not supposed to be an activist type position. That was sort of the way that he governed as president during the mid-1920s. He also, like Harding, was in favor of a high tariff to protect American businesses in international business dealings, and particularly preventing foreign companies from having free rein to import products into America without paying a heavy financial price. Together, both Harding and Coolidge also appointed a series of conservative businessmen, a host of conservative businessmen, I guess I should say, to influential federal positions outside of the cabinet posts that I've already discussed, particularly for vacancies on the Federal Reserve Board, the Federal Trade Commission, and the Interstate Commerce Commission. And as a result of these new appointees, each of these rather influential federal agencies that had been either established or strengthened during the progressive era presidencies of Roosevelt, Taft, and Woodrow Wilson, all of a sudden these agencies sort of de-emphasized federal regulation as a whole. Again, just more or less allowing business and corporate America a free hand to do as it pleased. From a policy standpoint, there was going to be very limited federal regulation for businesses to adhere to during the presidencies of first Warren G. Harding and then subsequently Calvin Coolidge. I mentioned Harding was an Ohio senator. Coolidge was a former governor of Massachusetts before he was vice president for Harding and then later president. If you take a look at the picture in the upper right-hand corner of this slide, you will see the two men together, obviously before Harding's death. That's Warren G. Harding on the left and Calvin Coolidge on the right. So that's the 29th and 30th presidents of the United States, respectively, the men who held the presidency for a good chunk of the 1920s, from 1921 until late 1928, early 1929. We will get into the presidency of Herbert Hoover later this week to sort of wrap up the 1920s and discuss the Great Depression. But the thing to know is that under Harding and Coolidge and later Hoover, there was a dramatic shift in federal policy with regard to economic policy, labor, investments, all of that. It shifted toward big business and corporations and away from ordinary rank and file workers in America. And that's sort of, in a nutshell, the essence of the Harding-Coolidge administrations. So, moving on, we will take a look at African American life in the 1920s, and I want to begin by discussing the tremendous growth of New York City, of the African American population in New York City during this time, as well as what that impact was. We've discussed the Great Migration in previous lectures. We particularly discussed how many Black Americans departed the South in the 1910s and early 20s for industrial cities in the Northeast and the Midwest, but I sort of focused our discussion on that with African Americans moving in large numbers to Chicago. But New York City also attracted a great deal of African Americans during that same time period. Not only did they attract African Americans from the South, but also African American immigrants were coming over to the U.S. in large numbers in the 1910s and the 1920s. As a result of this massive influx of African Americans, New York City was labeled by one observer as the greatest Negro city in the world. The city grew by 257% in terms of its African American population over the 2-decade period from 1910 through 1930, going from a population of 91,709 African Americans in 1910 to nearly 328,000 African Americans by 1930. By contrast, the white population of New York City increased by just 20% over the same time frame. As a result of this tremendous population influx, New York City in general and Harlem and in particular emerged as the leading cultural center of Black America during the 1920s. Elaine Locke, an African-American philosopher who was the very first African-American to earn a Rhodes Scholarship, he published a book called The New Negro in 1925. It was an anthology of works from a variety of African-American writers in a variety of genres, and many prominent African-Americans were very active from the early 1920s through the mid-1930s during this sort of period of what's known as the Harlem Rennaissance. This included novelists, poets, playwrights, very, very significant folks in American literature as a whole, and particularly giants within African American literature, including Langston Hughes, Zora Neale Hurston, Jessie Redmond Fawcett, and Claude McKay. There's just a few of the many African American writers and poets who really flourished and enjoyed their most productive creative years during the Harlem Renaissance. In addition to literary works and sort of a literary renaissance, there was a great deal of performing art talent in Harlem during this time. Big band leaders like Duke Ellington and Countee Cullen played in speakeasies and clubs. Jazz music becomes extremely popular throughout Black America during this time period, but especially in New York City. I mentioned in a recent discussion the first really popular movie with sound, talkie, if you will, was The Jazz Singer in 1927. Jazz music across America was becoming extraordinarily popular during the mid to late 1920s, and these artists found a home in Harlem in New York City to perform in all kinds of clubs. Unfortunately, many of these clubs were okay with hiring performing artists such as Ellington, but they did not exactly welcome Black patrons with open arms. They had restrictive policies with the number of local African Americans that could attend these concerts and nightly shows, and many of them were relegated to using service entrances or back entrances to get in. So there was a little bit of that Jim Crow segregation culture at play here, even in the Northeast, but it sort of permeated America from the 1890s and throughout the first half of the 20th century, not just in the South, but in other parts of America as well. Shifting gears from the artistic talent and atmosphere on display within Harlem during this time to political activism. There was a significant political figure at the grassroots level, a man named Marcus Garvey, who promoted what became referred to as Garveyism. Garvey was a Jamaican immigrant who arrived in New York City in 1916, and he shortly thereafter founded the Universal Negro Improvement Association, also known as the UNIA. And the basic premise of Garveyism and Garvey's worldview was that he objected to the philosophical ideas championed by W.E.B. Du Bois and the NAACP. Du Bois and the NAACP, which he co-founded, sought to integrate America socially, politically, culturally, and Garvey did not subscribe to that. He was inspired by Booker T. Washington, and he basically believed that in a form of black nationalism, he just quite simply thought that white Americans would never accept black Americans as equals, and as such, he thought that the black community in America should stop looking for support and fair treatment from their white counterparts. He specifically preached economic independence from the white establishment for black Americans. There were quite a few African Americans that across the country that were taken in by Garveyism. Garvey was a charismatic speaker that reached audiences through radio, but also in public speeches. He also, his organization, the UNIA, founded a newspaper called Negro World that was very popular. Hundreds of thousands of black Americans were interested in Garveyism and enlisted in the UNIA in some way, shape, or form during this time. For his part, W.E.B. Du Bois rejected Garvey's message of black separatism, and he described Garvey himself as, quote, the most dangerous enemy of the Negro race. He is either a lunatic or a traitor. Garvey, through investors, launched a shipping company known as the Black Star Line, and he ultimately wanted to convince America's black population to join him via the Black Star Line and return to Africa and leave America and form their own nation in Africa where they didn't have to depend on the benevolence of white businesses and white investors and anything related to white American business influence in any way, shape, or form. Garvey is in the picture in the upper right-hand corner of this slide. You can see the outfit he's wearing. He frequently gave public addresses and led marches in Harlem, dressed in this sort of conspicuous form of regalia, as he's wearing there, with the hat and the uniform. That was all part of his public persona. He, at one point, even engaged the Ku Klux Klan. He met with Klan leaders, and for all of their differences, he believed that they could agree on the fact that America should be a white nation, and black Americans should follow Garvey's lead and go back to Africa. Now, that's what Marcus Garvey believed. but he was certainly an influential and controversial activist and leader during the 1920s. He was indicted in the mid-1920s for mail fraud and later imprisoned and ultimately deported. Garvey died in London in 1940, but the memories of his movement, the memories of the UNIA persisted throughout the middle part and later part of the 20th century. His philosophy can be seen in the speeches and writings of Malcolm X, who expressed a similar sentiment of black nationalism, black separatism during the struggle for racial equality in the 1960s. Malcolm X, like Marcus Garvey before him, believed that it was a foolish proposition to expect white America to change and to extend political, social, economic equality and to African Americans. Malcolm X's parents were Garveyism believers themselves, so that's perhaps part of the reason why why Garvey's philosophies resonated so much with Malcolm X. That will conclude today's lecture, and I will talk to you again on Wednesday.